Well, here at the Brussels Forum, I'm joined by Michele Flournoy, who until a couple of years ago was the Undersecretary for Defence, but she's now in private practice running your own company. But you come to here with significant understanding of the enormity of change which is underway, Michele. What is your view of how much the very status quo, which many assume, is now at risk?
Well, I think the status quo that we've pretty much has evolved for the last 70 years. The rules-based international order, the role that the U.S. has played in leading that order and tending to it, its care and feeding, all of that is now changing. I think that we have a U.S. administration that doesn't really see that or embrace that role for the United States, and we also have a number of forces that are putting pressure on that inherited order. First of all, the return of great power competition. You have a revanchist Russia that objects to many aspects of the order, wants to see them changed by force if necessary, as we saw in Crimea and Ukraine. You have a rising China that feels that, hey, we didn't have a seat at the table when the order was being established. We're now going on the track to become one of the premier economic powers, if not the economic power in the world in 50 years. We want to see changes to the order. And again, they are also taking unilateral steps to change the status quo. You also see the rise of technology disruption, social media.
You're talking about algorithms and AI.
Yes, and just the connection of people across communities, across national boundaries, and so forth. So there's the inherited order and the sort of rules of the road that we've all become accustomed to are under pressure from a variety of sources. And then there's what's happening domestically in a lot of our countries, the rise of populism, the rise of
Is it populism or is it anti-establishment? In other words, a pushback against those who the public believe should be running?
I think it's both. I think there's a sense that, hey, this order has not served me. Globalization has only been a bad or perceived to be a negative in my life. I don't like all these immigrants coming in. I don't like the way my world is changing, the way the identity of my country is changing. I mean, there are threatened segments of the population that feel increasingly disempowered, disenfranchised. And I think they turn to leaders who offer not so much policy solutions, but more populist rhetoric that says, I feel your pain. I'm not one of these old establishment people. I can come in, I can make change. I'm the outsider. I can be your best friend. Whether they can actually do that or not is beside the point, but they appeal to the sense of grievance and to people who feel like the current system has not served them well.
How do you think current leadership is handling this? Because leaders evolve through a political system or they evolve through a corporate system. They get to the top by conforming in a certain way, either to political allegiances or to the way the companies always worked. How much do you think that is really under pressure now? In other words, those who are at the top really can't bring themselves to understand the enormity, like in Germany. In the end, they couldn't believe the enormity of the migration threat that they created, that happened 3 years ago, and look at the impact that that's had on political stability.
Yeah, no, I think leaders in both Europe and the U.S. are being surprised by the extent of the backlash. No one in the United States, not even Donald Trump himself, thought that he was going to win the presidential election. And there are a lot of factors that contributed to that. But I do think this is a period of disruption and disorientation for a lot of leaders who've come up with a certain set of rules and assumptions, and now those are being challenged.
Are they coping, do you think?
I think it's hard to generalize. I think the thing that worries me is I think we need to be focusing more on the core grievances. What is going on here? Where are these grievances coming from? And how do we address the root causes? Unfortunately, so much of our bandwidth in the media, in our daily news digest, in our discussions is more on the sort of what I would call the background noise of the ups and downs of, what's Trump tweeting today and what's, somebody else responding. It's very tactical. It's very consuming, and it's taking our bandwidth and our focus away from the more fundamental questions of how do we address the fact that technology and automation is going to basically put whole sectors of the labor market out of work? What do we do for those people?
And the challenge of reskilling.
Yes.
Do you think politicians really haven't gripped that yet? Because essentially, one of the downsides of this is social instability at some point, because the public don't have faith in their leaders anymore.
Well, I think people recognize the problem as a problem, but I don't think we're spending the right amount of time dealing with it. Another foreign policy example is we know that Russia interfered in the U.S. election cycle through social media and other means.
And in European elections.
And in European elections before that. And yet, we're still having, the media attention is focused on, does Trump admit that or not? Well, fine. He's not going to admit it. We all know why. I mean, he will acknowledge it sometimes, but usually deny it. It had no effect on the outcome, blah, 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 because it's very threatening to him to acknowledge it. But all of that aside, we are not focusing enough energy as a government, as a public-private partnership between the tech companies and state governments and election officials and so forth, to make sure this doesn't happen again and worse in 2018 and 2020. So again, we're sort of consumed by the soap opera of the political barbs on this issue, as opposed to focusing on what do we actually need to do in the next months before the midterms, and then 2.5 years before the next presidential cycle, to make sure that we have total confidence in the outcome of those elections.
Robert Kagan, in his opening remarks here at the Brussels Forum, in just 15 minutes, really laid down a very, very significant marker, in my view, that really we've come to the end of a 70-year period, which was a bit of a freak, of stability, of moving forward with institutions, with treaties, with good governance and so on. And that essentially this is now unraveling, but that's the way the world largely has been. Do you subscribe to that?
I think if we do nothing, he's correct. But I'm a little less fatalistic. I believe that good policy and good leadership can make a difference. And I think that if we have those who recognize the value of the order and who recognize its need to adapt to new circumstances and deal with some of these problems. But
do you think enough people do?
I actually think that there's a very strong consensus in the United States and in Europe that's probably the majority, but they're being challenged and stopped by very powerful minorities. I mean, so I would argue that even though President Trump is the president right now and his administration is going to take us in a different path, if you polled the bulk of certainly American elites, if you would have a different consensus that transcends Republican Democratic lines. The deeper divisions right now are within the parties, not between them.
Not unique to America either.
Right. And so you have, those on the extreme left and the extreme right who sort of reject the American role in the world and take a more isolationist, protectionist stance. But the vast majority still believe that U.S. engagement, U.S. leadership, tending to the rules-based order has been largely a positive experiment and something the U.S. should continue. But right now they don't have the presidency of the United States, and that's a problem.
Let's, in the last couple of minutes, though, look at how significant. I'd like a big idea from you, if you like. When you were in government until 18 months before this interview.
Well, actually, I came out in 2012.
When you look at what the Russian threat was and the Chinese threat was then, what do you see now in terms of understanding the enormity of what Putin and President Xi are really intending to do now, and how the West or the developed world is going to handle that?
Right. Well, I do believe that the defense strategy that was just put out by Secretary Mattis got it right to say that the primary threat for the U.S. military to be planning against going forward, and this I would count our NATO partners in this, is the return of great power competition and the need to compete more effectively, but also to deter conflict.
I'm paraphrasing here, but he gave the impression that really America had been wrong-footed in many ways on technology and capability, and had made assumptions about the adversary which were below what the adversary was now achieving.
Well, I think it was more that since 9/11, we've been very focused on the Middle East, on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and we have been slow to figure out how to access the best of cutting-edge technology, as the origin of that technology has shifted from what used to be DoD research and development monies to now the commercial sector. And what I think, what I would say, the big idea I would leave people with is there's now a sense of urgency. We've seen this coming for a while. We've watched Russian military investment. We have watched Chinese military investment.
Did you expect that kind of speed? I mean, we're speaking
No,
8 days after Putin gave that enormous AV show.
That was for domestic political purpose. I don't think there's huge surprises on the capability side. We've been watching this. But we have been slow to respond, partly because we were under the Congress put tremendous budget constraints on the Department of Defense for the last several years, partly because we were engaged in wars in the Middle East and so forth. But now we're in a window where we have to proceed with urgency. Either we make the investments now that we need in exquisite capabilities to counter what Russia and China have developed to try to prevent our power projection, prevent us from putting forces into the theater to protect our interests and our allies. Either we make those investments in a very smart way, very rapidly, or we will have we'll be behind, and we will have a situation where we may not have the high confidence in our ability to deter, and it will be much more costly for us to prevail.
And your big idea for leaders beyond the defense and national security, beyond into the issue of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the challenge to jobs, which in its own way is an internal domestic security issue, maintaining the stability of countries. What's your big idea for leaders there?
I think my big idea is spend less time on the tweets and news alerts of the day and focus on pick 2 or 3 big problems where you can make a difference in moving the needle, and focus on them now. I mean, we are already behind in terms of addressing some of the challenges associated with on both the national security side and also in terms of the disruption. There's huge opportunity on the technology side, as you know, but there's also some consequences that we're going to have to manage to ensure that they don't create a political backlash, which will be very damaging for us and for our European friends. So, I had a friend who recently took off some time and decided to limit her just got off Twitter, and limited her news intake to a certain number of minutes a day. Said it was just the most refreshing thing. She had all kinds of bandwidth to think great thoughts, to think about her next book, to think about what she was going to do next, to take up a new hobby. I mean, I think that is the thing. We have got to lift our gaze, look strategically, look over the horizon, and focus on having some impact on these very real challenges.
And a personal question, if I may, you're running your own private company.
Yeah.
Is it more satisfying now? Do you feel you can achieve much more almost outside government than actually inside government with all those pressures?
Certainly, given the current administration, I am happier outside than in. But WestExec advisors, we've put together an amazing team of former Democratic and Republican officials who really understand the world, and we feel that more and more companies are finding that geopolitics is coming in to touch their business, and so that's what we're trying to help with.
Michele Flournoy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.